Watch any Broadway Collection show and you'll understand why New York City has become an international theater destination. Broadway's been lighting up New York City for over 100 years. These iconic theaters have seen history unfold and held countless stories on their stages. But what happens at the end of the night, when the actors go home and the lights go out? What other stories live within these walls? I sat down with actor and Broadway historian Tim Dolan to find out. Do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts? I've been skeptical about ghosts my whole life, but in digging up a whole bunch of Broadway's ghost stories and seeing so many people that have had encounters, I think there's got to be something to it. My first awareness that there were stories to be collected, I was on this show called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. We played theaters that were 4,000 seats and these tiny little vaudeville theaters that were 200 seats. And every theater, no matter how big, how small, the moment our show was finished, one stagehand would roll out this singular light that's called a ghostlight. And this superstition of this one light center stage keeping all the ghosts at bay when we're not there. I was fascinated by the idea that all these not connected theaters were all connected with this superstition and this one light. And so as I started to go theater by theater, I started to collect stories. Any weird stuff that's happened in your building? Who else has danced on this stage before I've danced on this stage? What are the stories within these perhaps the most iconic theaters in America? And that's really where I started. Perhaps the most famous Broadway ghost, if that can even be a thing, is a woman named Olive Thomas at the New Amsterdam. It was one of the first theaters that I was digging into the history of. She's a name that came up a lot because she's so associated with the theater through the Ziegfeld Follies. And she, is the face of the Follies. She tragically dies in Paris in 1920 while on vacation with her husband, another actor named Jack Pickford. They lived a debaucherous life of lots of alcohol, lots of drugs. As the story goes, she had a headache. She went to take aspirin in the middle of the night and grabbed cleaning solution instead. It basically burns her esophagus and she dies. And it's this kind of horrific, tragic death that then the first time she appears at the New Amsterdam Theater is 1952. There's been many sightings of her ever since. They say every time she appears, she's very flirtatious, waves, very coquettish, blows some kisses. Subsequently, they say she's never been seen by a woman, only documented by gentlemen. She always appears in the same kind of garb, which is a gold and green beaded dress down to the floor, a sash across her chest which says O-L-I-V-E, her name, obviously Olive. This was a sash that was worn in the Ziegfeld Follies very often to tell the Follies girls, like the Radio City Rockettes, they're all identical, to tell them apart. This sighting of her in the dress and the sash has been what's seen most recently, 1999. Where a newly hired night watchman had this experience of seeing her center stage, 2:31 a.m., blew him a kiss. He didn't know really what was happening, and then she walked through the wall of the theater, and that's when he lost his mind, like anyone would, I think, and left this crazy voicemail on Disney's answering machine in the middle of the night, explaining what he had seen. And they came in the next day and said, probably at your job interview, we didn't tell you. We see things in the building sometimes, and everything you've described to a T is exactly what we see when we see Olive. The backstage world is a fascinating world because we see what the stagehands do, but we don't see them often. That's the goal. But they're the ones who are in the building the most. Stagehands stay with the theater, where the cast and crew and creative team and producers, once your show closes, you're leaving. They're staying. They are grounded humans that are in a world of construction and nuts and bolts and lights and heavy scenery. But amid all of that, when you really talk to them, you go, oh, you're just as superstitious as us. You just have better stories because you're within the walls longer and more than I am. And so yeah, if you can get a stagehand talking, it's tough. But when you can get a stagehand talking, it's game over. They have the best stories. So the Belasco Theater is my absolute favorite theater. It is this kind of crazy, beautiful, haunting edifice The namesake of the building is a man named David Belasco, director, writer, producer, stage manager, costume designer. But the quirky side of his life was he was Jewish by birth, he didn't practice religion, had a lot of friends who were Catholic, so he took it upon himself every single day of his life to dress like a Catholic priest. And his energy really, to me, has stayed in the building. The reason it's really stayed in the building is because he also built a 10-room duplex apartment on the roof of the building. So he builds the building as the Stuyvesant in 1907. 3 years later, 1910, puts his name on the building, and this is when he adds this huge part to the building. The first documented sighting was one of the first opening nights after he dies. He dies in 1931. I believe the first one was 1932. Stagehands would say that every opening night for about 25 years after he died, he would be seen at this same spot in the theater, in the balcony, holding onto this railing, in his priest suit, in his garb. He would sit down, he would disappear. And they said it was David checking in and deeming each new production worthy of his namesake building.
I'm Daniel Breaker. I'm an actor and performer on Broadway. I was doing a musical called Passing Strange at the Belasco, 2008. You can feel it. I mean, there are certain theaters that don't have a feeling of spirits being active. Certain pockets are sort of like damp, like opening up like a storage unit in Georgia.
So there's been many reports of him in dressing rooms. There was a production of Follies in 2001. Many of the chorus girls talked about putting their makeup on, looking at themselves in the mirror, and hearing a man whispering in their ear.
About a month into the run, my dressing room, it's got these two mirrors, like one mirror I'm sitting at and I can see this mirror behind me. So you sort of get that sort of like indefinite sort of like image. And I remember just getting ready, like just putting some makeup on, and I saw something in the reflection. It was like this man's face. Now, I'm a big Mahler fan, so I had this like Mahler poster in my dressing room, and so when I first glanced at it, I thought, oh, it's Mahler. And then I looked up again and realized that ain't Mahler. And it was Belasco in his sort of like, he used to wear these like crazy like papal outfits that he was obsessed with. And I just saw him staring at me. And I remember being both shocked and fearful, but comfortable in some way. And I remember just holding eyes with him for, I mean, it must have been like a good 45 seconds. And he was just staring, sort of a blank stare, and then he gave me like a nod. I don't know what that nod meant. Maybe get the hell out of my theater, or I love your work. I'm gonna go with the latter. And then I never saw him again. I was a little like haunted by it. I did not share that information with anybody until I shared it with one of the guys in the band, and he was like, bullshit.
When you say the Empire Theater, most people think 42nd Street and 8th Avenue, AMC Empire Movie Theater. Yes, that is an Empire Theater, but the more iconic Broadway Empire Theater was an avenue over and 2 blocks down, just south of 40th Street on Broadway. And the Empire Theater was built by a man named Charles Frohman. He was a showman, built a life in the theater, very wealthy, discovered a lot of stars, and this theater was his magnum opus. When people ask, tell me about the Empire, where my mind goes is the office at the very top of the theater. So you had your theater proper, the house below in the lobby. Above the lobby, you had stories of windows of all of the different offices of your network. But of course, the top is the head guy's office. And Charles Frohman's office on the top floor, he gets a telegram in 1915 from J.M. Barrie, who had written Peter Pan. They'd produced it together very successfully. J.M. Barrie in this telegram says, I just wrote a show in London. It's not going great. Will you get on a boat and come to London and help me fix my show? While you're here, you can pick up some other shows, bring them back to Broadway, kill all the birds with all the stones. Help me with this show. Charles Frohman's assistant was this incredible man named John Ryland. He says to John, JM wants me to come to London, get me tickets for whatever ship's leaving to go over and help him fix his show. And John books him passage on a ship, May 1st, 1915, they get downtown to this pier. John's putting Charles's suitcases down and says to him, I'm gonna watch over the theater for the week. I'll see you, I'll see you when you're back. Charles kind of tips his hat and starts to walk towards the ship. John leaves. 6 days later, John is closing up the theater, locks up the whole theater downstairs. There was an usher and a press agent. It was 3 men. The 2 men are downstairs. John goes upstairs to lock up all the offices and gets to Charles's office on the top floor. And he opens this door, and sitting at his desk in his leather chair is Charles, his boss, who should be basically in London. And he says to Charles, what's going on? And he said, there is all this stuff I had to attend to. Don't worry about me. I'll close up the office tonight. You close up downstairs. And John looks, and on his desk, there's all this stuff. And he looks at Charles and says, okay, yeah, I'll close up downstairs. Walks down the stairs, sees the 2 guys in the lobby, and they looked at him and said, it looked like you saw a ghost. And he said, no, not a ghost. I just saw Charles upstairs. And they said, well, what do you mean? Didn't you put him on a ship 6 days ago? And he said, well, yeah, I watched him walk towards the ship, but I didn't see him get on the ship. And these 3 men run up the stairs, open the door, lights are off, nothing on the desk, chair is tucked into the desk. And these 2 men look at John like, what's going on? And he said, I swear on my life, I just had a conversation with Charles. He wakes up the next day, opens his newspaper, and the front headline is, the Lusitania has been hit by a torpedo by a German U-boat. And Frohman was so important, so well known. Him and Vanderbilt are the 2 names in the newspaper. And so when the body's brought back to New York City, who receives it, who preps it for the funeral? Of course, his assistant, John Ryland. And for the rest of his life, John, on the demolition of the theater, says, I owe my entire life to this man and this building, and it's made me have an incredible life in the theater. But there's one floor of the building I've never stepped foot on ever since May 1915, and that's the 5th floor. I don't know who I saw in that building or who I talked to in that room, but I talked to someone. And when you time it, the time he's talking is almost the exact same time that Charles would have been going down with the Lusitania, with the time change and the hour difference. And so there's these weird kind of timeline matchups that, as someone who wants to be a skeptic, but is practical and pragmatic, when you put it all together, you go, something's here, something happened. This man experienced something, and we'll never know, but something happened in that office.
There's just such a magical energy about any theater, that we are putting on these stories and we are embodying these characters, and we are hoping to tell their stories, be it love or revenge or envy or pain or death. When you traffic in those spirits, it's beautiful to see some of them make their way unannounced.